Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 387 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Cadwell Turnbull. His short fiction appears in magazines such as Lightspeed, Nightmare, and Asimov Science Fiction, and his short story Loneliness is in Your Blood appeared in the Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy 2018. And we'll be speaking with him today about his debut novel, The Lesson, about mysterious aliens who occupy the U.S. Virgin Islands. And now here's our interview with Cadwell Turnbull. All right, so we're here with Cadwell Turnbull. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so how did you first get interested in fantasy and science fiction?
I think watching TV as a kid. So, one of my favorite shows growing up was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so I watched that almost like every week, staying up late. I also liked the spin-off Angel, watched a lot of space shows. One of my favorites was Stargate SG-1. And so a lot of TV, a lot of film. And then when I was in high school, they assigned 1984, which was at the time didn't seem to me like a science fiction book. I didn't know what that meant, but I knew that I liked it more than the other books that we were reading. And so that got me interested in reading books of that kind. In college, I read some Ursula Le Guin. So it was kind of like TV first and then books.
So when you say in college you read Ursula Le Guin, were those books that were assigned for school, or you were just reading those on your own?
No, a friend of mine recommended The Loth of Heaven and gave me her copy of the book, and I read it and I loved it. And then she recommended to me The Dispossessed, and I read that as well. And it was the first time that I read science fiction fantasy for fun and enjoyed it, and that opened it up for me. I started reading more of the genre on my own.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in your novel, it mentions the Foundation trilogy, 1984, The Left Hand of Darkness, the Earthsea series, The Dispossessed, Green Mars, and the Silmarillion. Are those the books that one of your main characters, Derek, likes? Are those some of your favorite books?
Not all of them. Some of them, Derek is a little bit more well-read than me, and especially for that time. I didn't read the Silmarillion until fairly recently, and I'm still working my way through the Foundation trilogy. But most of the other books are books that I have either read at some time or found later on in my life. And so I would say yes, mostly.
So you said you had a friend who recommended Le Guin to you. Have you had friends throughout your life who are interested in science fiction and fantasy?
So I grew up in the Virgin Islands, and I didn't really have a lot of friends that were reading science fiction and fantasy. It was something that most of the people I knew wasn't talking about. They weren't sharing this kind of work. It was something that I kind of discovered as I left the islands and I went to school and I did things elsewhere. It wasn't, I think I found my way through it or to it by meeting people along the way that was that grew up on it or that was interested in it, and they thought that maybe this would be something that I would like to.
Mm-hmm. You say in the acknowledgments that you were telling your extended family that you wanted to be a writer. So was that an interest you developed fairly young, or?
When I was a kid, I wanted to be a scientist. And I think I wanted to be a scientist because I was interested in how the world worked. I was curious about the world. And I only started thinking about becoming a writer after maybe middle school, when I was writing essays at the time, and my teachers expressed to me that I might have a knack for it. It wasn't something that I thought was a possibility before then. I didn't know that people could grow up and write in that way.
You also say in the acknowledgments, I was a strange kid with a lot of ideas. Like, in what way were you a strange kid?
I mean, I just used to spend a lot of time thinking an abnormal amount of time. It seemed to me that other people found me strange because I would sit and stare into space for a really long time. And among my family, I had this reputation of being a very spacey kid. And so I thought, oh, well, I guess I'm strange. I didn't know what about me made me strange, but I like thinking about things.
Mm-hmm. And so then you got an MFA, and you say also in the acknowledgments, you say Wilton Barnhart convinced me that NC State was where I needed to be. So what was that conversation like?
I was in AmeriCorps at the time. I was doing I was a media coordinator at this after school project, and I had applied to the creative writing program, and Wilton was on some travel. He was he has a tendency of like driving to different places because he likes to drive, and he was passing through, and he stopped in Pittsburgh, and we had a conversation. We sat down, had a lunch, and he basically just pitched to me why NC State would be the best choice. I had applied to it, and it was one of the places I applied to because at the time, me and my wife was we were looking for different places where we could both do our thing, and it didn't have to be the same school, but it had to be in the same area. And so she was looking at Duke, and I was looking at NC State, and I also saw that John Kessel was there, and I thought, oh, maybe this might be the kind of creative writing program that would be friendly to me. And so Wilton pretty much, I didn't need a lot of convincing anyway. I was already very interested, but he sold the program to me, explained to me what it would be like, what I could expect. And, also, told me that they were excited to have me, which made me feel, pretty good. So I was like, oh, okay, this seems like something that I could try.
So how much fiction had you written as you entered the program?
A couple failed attempts at novels. One urban fiction novel, one, I would say, fantasy dystopian novel. A couple short stories. Not much. I had submitted for the submissions process a longish short story that I had just recently wrote while I was doing the AmeriCorps thing, and it was one of the only completed works of long fiction I had at that time.
Yeah, and so the material that became your first novel, The Lesson, some of it was published as short fiction first, or at least one of them was.
Yes, A Third of the Stars of Heaven. Yeah, I published that in Lightspeed.
So when did you first write about this world that eventually became The Lesson?
When I was in my MFA. So I think the first semester of my MFA, I decided that I wanted to play around with this idea because I had a dream where aliens were integrated into a small town, and they looked and acted like humans, but occasionally would kill people. And so it seemed like a good concept, and I was kind of running low already on good concepts. And so I thought, okay, if I could do that idea and set it in the Virgin Islands, maybe this could be something that could work. And so that wasn't A Third of the Stars of Heaven, but it was one of the chapters that became The Lesson.
And you say that you thank your MFA instructors for telling me this was a novel, even when I didn't believe it myself?
Yeah, at first I didn't. So like when I wrote that first short story, I thought that was going to be it. And then I started writing more pieces of it. And it slowly, gradually over time became something that I thought had a larger story. And I didn't know what that was. I was struggling to figure out what to call it because it wasn't like the novel materialized itself as a whole thing. It was coming to me in pieces. And it was my professors, Wilton first, maybe. I think it was Wilton the first one that suggested it, and then Kessel suggested that this might be a novel and that I should start thinking about it in that way. And I started being a little bit more intentional about what the larger story was I was trying to tell.
So how many different pieces had you written in this world that you were thinking of as separate stories?
I think about by the time the MFA was over, I had written 7 pieces, and maybe about halfway through that, so maybe around like the 4th piece, I started thinking about it as a longer thing. So it took a while for me to get to the place where I was like, maybe this is a book, because novels give me a bit of anxiety. I had tried doing it before and failed, and so I was like, okay, these are just small things. And then it came to the point where I was doing it enough, and I kept returning to the place enough that I was like, well, maybe I'm not being honest with myself. Maybe this is something bigger.
And so you started publishing short stories, right, before the novel?
Yeah, I published. So A Third of the Stars of Heaven was actually one of my early short stories. Well, I published it as a short story. But before that, I published Loneliness is in Your Blood, and Other Worlds in This One, which was a novelette in Asimov's. Loneliness is in Your Blood was like a shorter piece about a Caribbean vampire. And so I kind of got my start, at least trying to publish things in the spec markets.
Did you start selling stuff pretty quickly, or did you have a lot of rejections before you started selling stuff?
Sporadically, when I was in the MFA, I tried sending things out, and I got a few rejections, but I wasn't really. I would send something out, and then I would get a rejection, and then it would sit there. And so I didn't really start seriously submitting things until after the MFA and after Clarion. And that's when I started like sending things and then getting rejections and then sending them out again. And so I got a few rejections then, but Loneliness is in Your Blood, which was the first thing that ended up getting published, I sent to Nightmare, and that got accepted right away. But that wasn't the case with all my stories.
Well, and that ended up in Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy, right? Is that one?
Yeah, 2018.
So that's pretty cool that your first published story got into Best American Science Fiction and Fantasy.
I was really surprised.
And then, so what was Clarion like? Did you have any memories that stand out from Clarion?
Yeah, I just remember feeling very ill-prepared. There was a lot of people. So it's like 18 people in a house, and all of them were talking about places they had submitted to and publications they had. And I was like, oh, I've barely sent anything out. I felt like it was kind of a strange feeling, but I think good, because I was like, oh, these are people that I could learn from. Because I clearly didn't know what I was doing. And so it was really, I say it was really pleasant in that way, that I had a lot of peers that I loved their work. They seemed to like mine. And, I learned a lot about the business of, being a writer, like sending things out, getting rejections, keeping track, that kind of thing. And also just getting to read other people that was interested in weird stuff and feeling encouraged to write weirder. Because the MFA, I sometimes felt like I had to do a little bit more work to convince people that I should be there, because I was writing science fiction fantasy, and not everyone was writing or reading that. And so it was just refreshing to be in a room of all science fiction fantasy horror people.
Absolutely. Were any of the instructors people that you had wanted to meet or work with?
N.K. Jameson. I had read a couple books of her Inheritance series, and I had read the first book of the 5th season. I think that was the only one that was out then, and loved it so much, and was a huge fan, and kind of wigged out when she came in and had like a really embarrassing fanboy moment. But it was It was really cool to be able to sit in the same room and hear her discuss my work and other people's work, and encourage us to do more of it. that was a really like cool moment.
Your fanboy moment was you were just really excited, or you were gushing, or like what happened?
Me and another Clarion West Team Arsenic member was in the basement when she showed up. There was a place where we would all hang out. There was couches and a TV down there, and somehow we managed to be the only two down there when she came in the front door. And so we heard her, and we heard I think the director at the time talking with her, and I remember freaking out because I hadn't gotten a haircut in a really long time, and so it's so embarrassing. And so we were both just down there talking about how nervous we were to meet her the first time and not having our hair done. It was me and another guy. So that was the embarrassing moment. She didn't see it, but now I'm talking about it. So, yeah.
So you mentioned Team Arsenic. What is that?
That's just what we call ourselves. Clarion West 2016. It was the 33rd year. The chemical symbol is arsenic. For that, that's a chemical number. And we call ourselves Team Arsenic. We have tattoos. We were a very close-knit bunch of people by the end of it.
How many people got tattoos?
More than half. I think about 2/3 of us, somewhere around 12 or 13. Yeah.
So then also you say in the acknowledgments that special thanks to Martha Millard for choosing to represent me when I only had a couple stories and a half-completed manuscript to my name. So tell us about that. How did you meet? This is your agent. How did you meet her, and like how did that all come about?
Loneliness is in your blood. She emailed me. She emailed me saying that she liked the story, and she asked me if I had anything else. And I gave her, at that time, I only had another short story published, the novelette that was in Asimov's, and I recommended that, and I sent her a copy of it. And she liked that enough to ask me if I had any, like, long work done. And at that time, I still hadn't finished the lesson. It was like maybe 2/3 finished. And so I sent her what I had. And she seemed to like that enough to ask to represent me.
Well, that's cool. And so then how long did it take to sell the book?
Well, once I sent that in, the piece of it that I had, and she said that there was promise there, she asked me when I would have it done, and I gave her a very ambitious estimate. I told her maybe like 6 months. And I managed to get it done. Maybe it took me an extra month, and then we did a round of revisions, just me and her, and then she sent it out to a few places, and almost immediately Blackstone responded that they wanted to publish it. So maybe like 9 months before I got the good news that someone might want to do something with it.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And so why don't you say a little bit more about the premise? You mentioned you had this dream of aliens and everything, but talk about just like more details about the setup for the novel.
Right. So it's set, pretty much in our present day, with a large part of it 5 years in the future. And it's about an alien race called the Ina that have come to Earth. They're doing research of some kind, and they have made an exchange. They're gonna give us some things that we need, some technology, some cures for some diseases, in exchange for doing research in the U.S. Virgin Islands. They're very cagey about what that research is, but the governments of the world are pretty much on board as long as nothing. Pretty much, don't attack us. Do what you want. Thank you. And so the story takes place in the Virgin Islands, exploring the relationship between these newly arrived Ina and some families in the Virgin Islands and the larger community, and how the culture clashes that result from their arrival.
And the Ina, they have sort of tentacles on their heads and sharp teeth and all these things, but they're able to kind of pass for human when they are interacting with the local people.
Yeah, there's so the Ina can manipulate their appearance. And so when the Ina are when they're interacting in the world of the humans, they tend to appear as human. And when they're, amongst themselves, they can appear in their natural form, which is kind of like, I picture it as a cross between, octopus, shark, and a mollusk.
I mean, I don't know if you saw Paul D. Filippo's review of the book, but he was pointing out that these sorts of stories where aliens are basically sort of integrated with humans or living among them in the more or less the present are actually fairly unusual. He lists a couple examples, like the TV show Alien Nation,
right?
But there aren't really that many. Was that something like when you were writing this? Did you think like this is this has not been done that much, or were there other examples that you were fond of or anything?
I think maybe V. I had watched the remake of V. It's the one where there's like these lizard aliens and they're wearing human skin. But reading Paul DeFilippo's review was really informative to me. The examples that he had listed was things that I had not heard of, and it was like, oh wow, this is it actually was comforting to see that there's a history of that kind of fiction, and that I wasn't writing something. And I didn't think of it as entirely new. I just thought of it as a thing that came to me and it fit. It made sense to me. But it was cool to see that, there's other writers that had played with this kind of fiction before.
And the alien spaceship kind of looks like a giant seashell. Do you remember how that idea came to you?
I think it came to me thinking about the technology that the Ina use. So they use this kind of smart cell technology that it manages their physiology within their bodies, but they can use it to build mega structures. They use it to build cities. They use it to build ships. And it seemed to me like the closest analog was seashells. And so I thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if the ship kind of took on that image as well?
Yeah, no, I think that's really cool. I mean, and you must have seen a lot of, I assume you saw a lot of seashells growing up. Did you ever think they looked sort of alien?
Yeah. And conch shells, which are larger and stranger looking. And when you put your ear to them, you can kind of hear the ocean. I always thought that was really cool. And so when I was looking for something, when I was trying to imagine what the Inas would look like and how they would work and their technology, it seemed to me that this would be a really cool thing to play with. And since they came from an ocean planet, it seemed to me that there might be some kind of common physiology, common evolution of alien life on their planet.
So also the book delves quite a bit into the history of the U.S. Virgin Islands. Could you just talk about what sort of historical research did you do for the book?
So I read a Virgin Islands history book, which was I think it was published in the 1970s, and looking on my shelf for it, but it kind of went from the Danish settlement of the island all the way up to the American acquisition of the Virgin Islands. And then I read for the scenes that took place during the slave revolt. I read a fictional retelling of it by a historian called The Night of the Silent Drums. And I also read a couple travelogues of the island, St. John, and some document collections of the time. There was a couple books that were published that was just articles, letters, newspaper clippings of that period of time, and I used that to help me fill in some of the gaps.
So then when you were doing the research, reading those books, was the history that you were discovering, was it pretty much what you expected or what you were taught in school, or were there things that surprised you that you were discovering?
A lot of it was surprising to me. I mean, we had a Caribbean history class growing up. You know, the teachers were trying to give us some idea of our history, but we also took a lot of American and European history. So a lot of that stuff stood out more to me when I was a kid. I kind of glossed over a lot of the Caribbean bits. And so it was really cool to actually get to read specifically about the Virgin Islands, specifically about St. Thomas and St. John and St. Croix, and figure out and learn things about our history that I either didn't learn in class or I wasn't paying attention to. There was some really great stuff about pirate history, and there was some references to piracy, all of the different colonial powers robbing each other's stuff, which was really fun. There was a lot of stuff about slave society in the Virgin Islands, which was things I didn't know. A lot of one of the books I was reading actually gave you like counts of how many slaves were on island versus how many whites, and it was like disproportionate how blacks to whites. It was maybe I would say maybe like 300 blacks to every one white person on the island at any given time. And then they would also break down the black population between enslaved and free, and there was a significant amount of free black people, which was really interesting. Just, you know, a lot of really cool stuff. The different plantations that were on the different islands, the stuff that led up to the emancipation in the Virgin Islands, because there was a pretty popular revolt that happened on St. Croix, and I got to read a little bit more about that. I had known some of it, but not all of it. Yeah, it was, you know, it was just like a really cool opportunity to just move through the history and see the things that I had thought I knew, but get to know them in more detail.
Well, you know, I heard you say in an interview that when you came to the U.S. that, you know, you would tell people you were from the U.S. Virgin Islands, and a lot of people just wouldn't know even where those were. And I'll confess, I don't know a great deal about them. In the book, it describes the relationship as between the American government and the U.S. Virgin Islands as being, quote, absentee landlordism. Could you say a little bit more about what does that mean?
Right. So when I first went to Pittsburgh for my undergrad, I would talk to people about the Virgin Islands, and a lot of people just had no idea that we were territories of the U.S. And so I would say Puerto Rico. I was like, we're really close to Puerto Rico, and they kind of had an idea of where that was and what that was, maybe. And so that would get them to situate me in relation to that. I would say I'm like 15 minutes plane ride from Puerto Rico, and then they'd be like, oh, okay. And I would be like, I'm like maybe 2 hours south of Florida. And they were like, oh, okay. And so in the culture itself, there's just a general dismissiveness of the territories. And the Virgin Islands, because it's so small, the population is a couple 100,000 people. It's easily overlooked, and the U.S. government doesn't really talk about it in any meaningful way either. There hasn't been a significant conversation about statehood or independence. When things happen in the Virgin Islands, recently there was a pretty terrible hurricane in 2017. There wasn't a lot of news about the Virgin Islands. There was a lot of news about the hurricane making landfall in Florida. This is Hurricane Irma. But all of that time, people on my Facebook were trying to figure out if their family members were okay. There was no news coverage of what was going on in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And so it was like a lot of news coverage talked about if Irma made landfall in Florida, it would be hitting the U.S. And it was like, well, we're the U.S. It already hit us, and we weren't hearing anything. And so there's just this kind of general cultural lack of knowledge about the territories, but there's also the way even the government thinks about the territories. It's an afterthought, if that much. The way that policy is designed around it, the way that aid is thought about when thinking about the relief efforts in the Virgin Islands, it's kind of something that's like, oh, we can help them out if we want to, especially with this administration. But this has always been true. It's just this kind of feeling of being invisible or being absent from the larger conversation of Americanness.
I mean, do you have a feeling about whether the U.S. Virgin Islands should be independent or should be a state or should just be getting more attention? Or
I don't know. I've thought about it quite a lot, and I haven't decided whether independence or statehood. I know that I don't like the fact that we're a territory, but there's people that may disagree with me. There's a lot of conversation about there's a little bit of a freedom that comes from being associated with the United States, but not a state. There's a kind of opportunity there to kind of determine some level of destiny, but I don't know if that is enough to justify the current status. I think that there's ways that being a state or being independent would benefit the Virgin Islands.
I read, you wrote this article that was in Nightmare magazine where you were saying that you were sort of talking about your experience of watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer and how, how strange it is that it's not a big deal that this town in California is infested with demons and everything, but saying that kind of made sense to you growing up in the islands because you kind of felt like you were off people's radar. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, I think I wrote in the article that if there were demons in the Virgin Islands, no one would notice. It would be kind of the same deal as in Sunnydale, where there's a hellmouth and it just doesn't seem to pick up national attention. I feel like if that was happening in the Virgin Islands, it would be similar. So I kind of related to that kind of feeling of being isolated. And I think it was one of the things that I kind of put into the lesson, this idea that a lot of things are happening on the islands and no one really seems to care because it's not really important, at least to people in the mainland or on the world stage, but it is important to the people that live there.
Well, you were making the point, too, that how plausible is it that this Sunnydale, this sort of upper middle class suburb, doesn't attract attention, that really the people who get ignored aren't upper middle class suburbs, Right.
It seemed more likely that it would be someplace like the Virgin Islands, someplace like some isolated Black community somewhere. I was a kid. I did not have a lot of race theory then. So I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. They're isolated. That makes sense. That's how I felt.
I mean, in one of the interviews I watched with you, you were saying that in your MFA program, you say, quote, I could see this impulse to move away from politics in the work that people were writing. Could you talk about that?
I think that literature generally, or at least I think it's true also in genre, but it's especially true in literary fiction. There's this kind of impulse to write about individuals and the struggles of individuals, psychology maybe, or internal conflicts or relational conflicts, but not necessarily how people engage with the larger world. What are the conflicts that are brought on by society? And it's one of the things that I felt attracted to in science fiction and fantasy, that that was more of a conversation. And it was something that I constantly wanted to write about in my fiction. And I could see sometimes when I wrote about it that there was a level of resistance.
This because people disagreed with your politics, or it's like they had this feeling that it wasn't artistic to write about politics, or?
I think is generally the understanding is that it's politics isn't very artistic. There's you write about people, you don't write about the politics of the world, but it seems to me that it's impossible to write about people without the political. And so it wasn't, I wouldn't say I necessarily was trying to consciously bring politics into my stories, but it just came into my stories because that is how I engage with the world. That was what I was interested in. If I'm writing about the Virgin Islands, I am going to talk about the fact that, I'm going to talk about the relationship between the Virgin Islands and the United States. That's a political conversation. But it's a part of the lived experience of Virgin Islanders.
Well, and certainly a lot of those books you mentioned as being your favorites, like 1984, The Dispossessed, Green Mars, have a lot to do with politics.
Yeah, very political. And I found 1984 was one of the, I think it was 1984 and Brave New World. I think I read those two books at the same time in 1984. Brave New World as well, but 1984 stuck out to me because it was so deeply engaged with political things. I didn't know at the time that that was something that I wanted, but when I read it, I was deeply moved by it in a way that I wasn't for other books that I was reading at the time.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk about some of the ways in which you've written about politics? I mean, you mentioned that in the lesson it has to do with, the relationship between the U.S. Virgin Islands and the American government and so on. But then you also, you wrote a piece that appeared or a couple pieces actually, that appeared in Grassroots Economic Organizing. And you had a story called When the Rains Come Back that involves the concept of panarchy. Could you talk about some of those things?
When I was in my MFA, as I was writing about, as I was writing pieces of this what became the lesson, I was also really interested and engaged with ideas of economic justice, just as a means of answering some of the racial justice questions that I had, seeing communities that were impoverished, trying to figure out ways that those communities could have more agency over their lives and their community. And it seemed to me that thinking about ways that a community could gain capital for themselves and build infrastructure on their own, not asking for permission, not begging for a loan, but working together, finding some kind of enterprise, and then pooling those resources back into the community to build the wealth of the community. That was something I was just thinking a lot about, and at the time I didn't know that there was a movement or a history to that, solidarity economics. And so it was just something that as time went on and I did more reading, and I think at some point I was trying to write a science fiction story that imagined a future public housing community building wealth for themselves. And then I stumbled across cooperatives and that kind of stuff. And so I was just, through that research, through just being really interested in that as a way of imagining better futures for marginalized people, I got excited about alternate systems of governance, alternate systems of economics. So it seemed to I think really materialize out of my interest in science fiction and also my interest in social justice.
When you say that there's this larger community involving these things like solidarity, are there, do you go to meetings, or are there online communities or websites, or how do you follow that, or how are you involved with that?
So you mentioned Grassroots Economic Organizing. That is a collective of academics, scholars, activists, people within the movement of cooperatives. So people that live in cooperative housing, people that do have worker-owned businesses. So businesses owned by the workers and governed by the workers. And so members, the members are made up of people that have those interests or those backgrounds. And so I've been part of it for a couple years, and I attend meetings. I I try to do work when I have time. I go to retreats, that kind of stuff. Just being in the same room with people that are interested in that stuff. I read a lot about examples in the United States. There's several thousand worker co-ops in the United States, and so I try to learn about them. It has kind of slowly trickled into my fiction, that sort of thing.
How about this concept of panarchy? Could you talk about that?
I really don't know when or how I stumbled across it, but it was, I knew I was thinking a lot about the idea that governance could be chosen. So like being a part of a government that is not, restricted by place, but is a part of a group dynamic. It's a form of community. And so, I was reading something online about this kind of laissez-faire governance where you take the ideas of how it started was taking ideas of capitalism, the ability to be able to choose your own, I don't know, cell phone provider, and taking that idea and moving it to governance. Wouldn't it be cool if you could pay dues to a government of your choosing, and that you could form a contract with that government, and that other people could do that, and that was something that could be a form of governing your life. You can have someone come up with the rules for that particular group, and based on your satisfaction, you would continue to be a part of that group. Or you could do, and there was I started reading other articles about the ability to have one and then also join another one to do other things that you might want to do, and that kind of thing. There was a lot of theory around panarchy and polyarchy that was I think collected on a website called panarchy.org or something. And I don't know how I found it, but I found it and I started reading articles on it. And I think when I got attracted to the idea, but I also saw how it could be exploited in the same ways that capitalism can be exploited. So I was interested in exploring what are the good things about this idea and what are the things that would be some problems that would come out of it. And so I imagined a world where there are anarchist communities and they govern themselves, but they're next to socialist governments and more democratic capitalist governments, and that there's all of these different ways they interact and work together, but none of them are denying each other's existence. They're just kind of competing for the affection of the people.
Yeah, it seems like a really interesting idea to me. Do you have any sense of like how some of this stuff would work in practice? I mean, sort of the idea, I guess, is that, each person just sort of fills out a checklist or something where they're like, I want to live under the communist government, I want to live under the capitalist government, the monarchist government, the anarchist government, etc. And then they're governed by that set of rules. But like, how does that work in terms of like if there's a pothole on the street or something, and the different houses on the street have pledged allegiance to different governments, or like is the policing difference, like say, like drugs are legalized for the libertarian people, but not for for one of the other ones. Do the police know who to arrest and who not? Like,
right?
Has there been discussion of that sort of granular kind of stuff?
There's a bit of discussion of how it would look on the ground level, and I didn't really get in when the rains come back. I didn't really get into all of those specifics. I have some ideas of how that would work. I think it's kind of like volunteered restriction. So if you think drugs are bad, then you would probably choose a government that restricts drug use. And then if you got caught, which is kind of crazy, but if you got caught using the drugs that you thought were bad, then you would be punished under the rules of that government. But the way that I wrote about it in the story that I wrote was that there was kind of rules and bylaws that were a part of each government that you would kind of sign on to depending on what you were interested in. But then there was also like a kind of a general assembly of governments where they would decide on the rules that governed everyone. So it's like you couldn't go over to the anarchist side of the community and kill someone and say that that's legal there. It was pretty much agreed upon by everyone that certain types of crime would be punishable by agreed upon penalties. And so a bit of agreed upon rules and restrictions for the community and laws, and then also within different governments, and they kind of coexist in the same space, other agreements about how to live life and what would happen if you had conflicts with your neighbors, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so there would need to be, I guess, a lot of interfacing between the different governments, that they wouldn't be all just separate.
Yeah, it's not, at least the panarchy that I imagine wasn't very isolationist. They were having conversations about how could they live together peacefully. And then there was a kind of United Nations where they would talk about abuses. So making sure that the capitalist governments, for example, didn't try to buy out the land of some anarchist government. And so there were, and ways of how to deal with that if it was to happen and that kind of thing.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I also want to ask you, so in the lesson, there's a scene where one of the characters is at the beach and notes that seaweed is kind of taking over the beach, and they said that this never happens before and maybe it's global warming. I was just curious if you had personally seen any effects of global warming from your time in the U.S. Virgin Islands.
So the thing that I can talk about most directly is hurricanes. So it's not that they're more frequent; they're just stronger, and there's just a general sense of fear among people back home in the Caribbean generally about what the future is going to look like with global warming and the strengthening of hurricanes. There's also some level of damage to coral reefs due to global warming. They're dying. And so there's some of that. And that particular scene came out of me going back to one of my favorite beaches and finding a lot of seaweed there and wondering why that was happening. And so I just had one of my characters wonder the same thing. I have no idea if it's related. It's just something that I noticed and I was like, oh, that's strange. That there was never seaweed here before.
Do you know Tobias Buckell?
Yeah, we've met a couple times. He was in the Best American the same year I was. Really cool guy. Grew up in the Virgin Islands.
Yeah, no, he's an old friend of mine. We actually went to Clarion together back in 1999.
Oh, dope.
But he grew up on a boat in the Caribbean, and he was telling me, after one of the big, I think it was Hurricane Andrew, but after one of the big hurricanes came through, that you just couldn't live on a boat where he had in the area where he had been anymore, because you couldn't get insurance anymore because the hurricanes had gotten bad enough that nobody was willing to sell you insurance. And it just sort of, wiped out this whole way of life that people had been living for hundreds of years, I guess.
Yeah. I did not know about that, but there's, that doesn't surprise me. There's also this, we talked a little bit, me and Tobias, about disaster capitalism, like the idea of people buying up, damaged property that people have abandoned because of hurricanes. And that's happening. That's always been true, but it's happening more and more because the hurricanes have been increasingly, more devastating. And so there's been, people come and they buy up, things on the cheap and then they rebuild them. And it's one of the ways that, it's one of the conversations that people are having in terms of local control versus, outside control. I think some people have also called it climate gentrification. So the idea of that wealthy people will have an advantage in places like this, that are experiencing the most damage from climate change, that they'll be able to buy and use this property and abandon this property. But, for the people that live in those places, it'll be devastating for them. And, it means losing their jobs, losing generational, homes. A lot of people that live in the Virgin Islands live in homes that their parents or their parents' built. And when a hurricane comes and it destroys that property, it's not just destroying a home, it's destroying, generations of legacy. And so it's one of those things that people are extremely worried about.
I'm just curious. So there are a couple lines in the book that sort of suggest that maybe science fiction is unhealthy in a way. So there's a part where it says, Derek had trouble with things right in front of him. They never seemed big enough, grand enough. And then another part where a character thinks, she could never fill that desire Derek had taught himself to have, that those books had infected him with. And I was just curious if you think there's any downside to reading too much science fiction.
That's interesting. When I wrote those lines, I wasn't thinking about it as a critique of science fiction as a whole. I was thinking about it more as a personal Derek thing. But I guess I can see the argument that for some people, if they read science fiction, it might prevent them from that certain form of escapism, by prevent them from being interested in things that are down to earth, that are happening in the moment, the kinds of things that aren't really that interesting but are important. Minutia is the kind of stuff that you don't read about in stories. I remember having a conversation with some friends on Facebook about the idea of writing civic fiction, and most people responded with, "That sounds really boring." And so I imagine, like, if I read a lot of different types of science fiction. I think that science fiction is deeply thoughtful, and it engages with really important questions. It's critical of the world, and it's I don't think that it's too pie in the sky, or it's too distracting from the real world. But I could see, if you're reading only one kind of science fiction, that could be the case. I don't know. I don't think that's how I have been affected by it, but it's possible.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, because you talk about, the kind of science fiction that you're writing and reading and that we're talking about all has to do with all these very serious real world issues. So on the one hand, it's not escapist at all. But on the other hand, I do spend a lot of time reading all this stuff and then not necessarily balancing my checkbook or whatever, so it's like there is some level of which, thinking about the big picture things, can sort of take you away from what you need to be doing right now, at your desk right now, Yeah,
there's some ways that a good science fiction book or movie or TV show, it can be escapist. I see it in my own life, ways that I would much rather watch a really good science fiction thing thinking about the world than actually engaging actively in the world. I try to balance that, but I feel like it's very attractive. I mean, the real world, I feel like the stakes are both low and high. Like in a book, you can kind of solve a problem with a few sentences. But in the real world, those 10 years later is actually real years, and you have to actually spend the time doing the work that you can just jump. In a book, you can just make a page break and you're there. It's real. And, there's a lot of little decisions there. And then there's also a lot of ways that you can just mess it up completely. And, there's no do-over. There's no edit. And so I can see how it's attractive to read about it and talk about it, but not actually do the things. I think that's why I've been attracted to writing, fiction that's kind of problem solving and looking at things in the immediate future, like trying to extrapolate a world where there's a bit more economic democracy, which is just basically workers that own their work and that govern their businesses together collectively, that kind of thing. So imagining that, I feel like it's plausible, and I think you could do that. Figuring out how to fix global warming, I think is a larger problem, but I think that you can get there by writing the kind of fiction that's a little bit closer to the present, that shows the steps. I feel like I've been excited lately about that kind of fiction.
All right, cool. So we're pretty much out of time. So do you have any final thoughts or any other projects you want to mention?
I am currently working. I'm pretty close. I'm trying not to jinx it. I'm pretty close to wrapping up my second book, No Gods, No Monsters. It's a contemporary fantasy. It's kind of, I would pitch it as like a very political Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There's a lot of monsters, and they're advocating for their rights and coexistence among humans, but there's a lot of reasons why that's messy. And so it's a book about that, and I'm hoping that it will be a series. We'll see.
And the title is a play on No Gods, No Masters, right?
Yeah, definitely.
If people don't know, it's sort of an old political slogan.
Yeah. So. And it kind of, there's a lot of people. So like there's the monster stuff, but there's also a lot of like solidarity, economic stuff, and consensus politics and that kind of stuff too. I'm trying to like have both conversations at the same time, have something sexy and interesting and fun, but also mix that with some vegetables, so to speak. People having long meetings and deciding about how to govern their bookstore and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that all sounds great. And so I think we're going to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Cadwell Turnbull about his new novel, The Lesson. So Cadwell, thank you so much for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Cadwell Turnbull for joining us on the show. And remember that Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoyed the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time contribution, you can do that via check or PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.